What up,
y'all?
It's your boy Dro.
And this your girl Cash.
Back with another video.
Yes, we are.
Y'all see we got the one and only Mr. Ballin. The world's most haunted cemetery is also the most dangerous.
Real photo evidence.
Real photo evidence. It's not no film. The world's most haunted.
And the most dangerous graveyard?
The
cemetery, man?
I gotta check it out.
Check it out.
Hey, let's get into this video, y'all.
Today's video is a classic scary story. It's about a group of people in Scotland who go into this infamous cemetery in the middle of the night, and they encounter something very bizarre, and amazingly, they actually manage to get a photo of it. And so if you stick around till the end of this video, you will see that photo. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the like button if you can quickly use their cell phone to just make a simple, quick call to your parents, and then as soon as they hand it over, immediately factory reset it and throw it off a cliff. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late one night in November of 1999, a 66-year-old minister named Colin Grant opened up the iron gates of a cemetery called Greyfriars Kirkyard. The cemetery was one of the oldest and most famous cemeteries in Edinburgh, Scotland. Now, the cemetery was basically pitch black. However, there were a few old iron lanterns that lined the cobblestone path that cut through the cemetery. And so Colin pushed open these big gates, and he stepped onto this path, and he began walking, and on either side of him, for as far as he could see, were all these headstones, some of which dated back to the 1600s. And as he kept walking, he could see up ahead, even in the darkness, the huge Gothic-style church that sat right in the center of the cemetery. Now, at first glance, this cemetery just kind of looked like a pretty typical old cemetery, albeit a pretty spooky one. But to Colin, he knew there was far more than just a graveyard here. Deep underground in this cemetery, below where all the people have been buried at their headstones, was basically another cemetery. There was like this mass burial pit that the cemetery had been built on top of. And in this lower level cemetery, which in no way was marked, I mean, this is basically a hidden mass burial, were thousands of people who had been starved and tortured to death hundreds of years ago. And so Colin stopped for a second on the path and just kind of stared ahead at this church. And for a second, he thought about just turning and leaving because he did not want to be here. He was really only here because the city had begged him to come here. Colin, in addition to being a minister, claimed to be a psychic, which meant he could speak to the dead. And so the city, in desperation, had asked him to come to this cemetery tonight and perform an exorcism. And so as much as Colin did just want to turn around and leave, he knew he really had a duty here, not just to the city, but really to the people of the city. Because if he didn't do this exorcism, there was a good chance more people were going to get hurt. The only thing that was making Colin a little bit less afraid in this moment was he actually was not alone in the cemetery. There were two people with him. There was a journalist and a photographer from a local newspaper who were basically tagging along to document this exorcism. And so, after taking a minute to compose himself, Colin continued walking deeper into the cemetery with these two following behind him. And then before reaching the big church, Colin left the path and began cutting through the grass, passing by different headstones, on the way to perhaps the most infamous building in the entire cemetery, the Black Mausoleum. The Black Mausoleum was this tall stone crypt with a rounded top that had been built sometime in the late 1600s. And as Colin got closer to this pretty creepy looking building that sat basically on the side of the cemetery, Colin began to feel this really intense sense of dread come over him. And the closer he got, that dread began to kind of manifest itself in like a pit in his stomach. And eventually he began feeling really scared of this building. And eventually Colin actually had to fully stop about 10 or so feet away from the building because he just felt like he couldn't go any closer. It felt evil. And then Colin turned and looked at his companions, the journalist and photographer, to see if maybe they were reacting to this mausoleum, but the two of them were just standing there with blank expressions on their face, like obviously not thinking that anything sinister was happening here. You know, even though the city had asked the minister to be here to perform this exorcism in this mausoleum, it didn't mean everybody believed what was going on here, and clearly these two didn't. They were totally skeptical. But this didn't offend Colin. He was used to people not believing in the things he believed in. And he knew as soon as he actually began his work, doing this exorcism, they would change their mind. And so at some point, Colin told the photographer that, hey, I'm going to go in the mausoleum now because I have to do the exorcism. Before I do, take a picture of the mausoleum. And so the photographer just raised her camera and took a picture of the mausoleum. Colin thanked her, and then he turned and began walking towards the building. And when he got right in front of it, he looked up and he read the name across the top of the crypt. And it said George McKenzie. And as Colin read that, he could feel his heart rate start to spike. So back in the late 1600s, George McKenzie was a Scottish lord who worked for the King of England, enforcing the king's religious laws. But at the time, these laws were very unpopular. And there was one group called the Covenanters who hated these laws so much that they actually mounted a full-scale rebellion in 1679. But their rebellion failed miserably, and this is when George McKenzie came in. He captured over 1,000 Covenanters, and he marched them all into this huge field, which would later become the Greyfriars Kirkyard Cemetery, but at the time it was just a big open field, and he held them there, and for weeks he had these people starved and tortured and mutilated, and if anybody tried to run or resist, because they knew they were doomed, they all knew they were going to die here, if anybody took off, he would capture them, cut their head off, and then place their head on a spike around the perimeter of this field. Until, after several weeks, the entire field is just ringed with decaying bodies and bloody heads on spikes. And so after a few months of this, basically everybody in that field had been murdered in some horrible way by George McKenzie. And their bodies were all dumped into a mass grave in Greyfriars Kirkyard and covered over, and then, hundreds of years later, a proper cemetery would be built right on top of that mass grave. Yes. And then, when George McKenzie died later on, he lived a normal, happy, full life after doing all these horrible things, they built him this beautiful mausoleum in Greyfriars Kirkyard. And so here's this horrible person, George McKenzie, who's a mass murderer, and he's put to rest in this beautiful mausoleum, just, feet away from this mass grave of all these people he killed. For almost 300 years after Mackenzie was buried, Greyfriars Kirkyard was quiet. It was not considered a haunted place. That all changed, though, in 1998, so that was 1 year before Colin showed up to perform this exorcism. That year, in 1998, a homeless man broke into the Black Mausoleum, and he fell through the floor and landed in one of those mass burial pits of those people Mackenzie had killed. And apparently, basically right after this happened, visitors to the cemetery began reporting the same thing. That anytime they were in or near the Black Mausoleum, they'd get pushed or tugged on or scratched or burned or even strangled. People were coming out of the cemetery terrified. And so quickly, people in town began to speculate about, what was going on in the cemetery, and quickly a story began to circulate around town that maybe when that guy fell through the floor in the mausoleum, that had released George McKenzie's evil spirit, and his spirit was responsible for all these attacks. And so it went on like this for about a year, until finally this young woman was found outside of the Black Mausoleum, unconscious, looking like she'd been strangled, and when she came to, she had no memory of what happened, and so people assumed this had to be another attack by the spirit of George McKenzie. And so by this point, the city was totally fed up with this. They didn't know what to do. And so they said, you know what? Let's just try an exorcism. Let's have someone go into that mausoleum and literally confront the spirit of George McKenzie and banish him. Get him out of here and stop this madness. And so ultimately Colin was hired to perform this exorcism.
I see why he was scared.
Yeah.
As Colin stood there, reading the name George McKenzie and mentally preparing himself to go inside of this horrible place, he realized he just couldn't do it. This was too much. And so Colin is just standing there feeling totally stressed out. He's embarrassed. He feels like a coward. He has no idea what he's going to say to the photographer and journalist who've literally come out here to document what he's going to do, and now he's not going to do it. But as Colin turned around to basically blurt out this really embarrassing news that, hey guys, we gotta leave, he realized he actually knew something else he could do that in many ways might actually be better than going into this mausoleum and doing an exorcism. And so without saying anything, Colin just turned and began speed walking over to this big field that was not too far away from the Black Mausoleum. And when he got there, he just began chanting prayers and walking in circles, flicking holy water, didn't explain anything he was doing to the journalist and the photographer who'd followed him over there and are just watching him like, what's going on here? They got no idea. He's not clarifying. And for hours, this is what he did. He just kind of paced in this field, just kind of doing what looked like stereotypical, exorcism type behavior. And that's what the journalist and the photographer assumed he was doing. And so as Colin did whatever he was doing in this field, the photographer, whose name was Susan Burrell, just began doing her job, again, thinking that he was doing the exorcism. And so she just started taking pictures of him. And then finally, around 2 a.m., so again, this has been hours of Colin doing this thing he's doing, Colin just abruptly stops and walks over to Susan and the journalist, and Colin looks horrible. He's totally haggard, his hair's all disheveled, he's sweating, he's pale, and his head is down, and he says to the two women, "I failed." He explained to them that his original intention was to go into the Black Mausoleum and confront George McKenzie's spirit head on and banish him from the cemetery. However, he had had a change of heart at the door and decided to go this other route, which was to go to this big open field in the middle of the cemetery and attempt to free the spirits of all those Covenanters who had been tortured and killed by George McKenzie. Colin's thinking was, if I can free all of these poor tortured souls, that maybe once they're gone, George McKenzie's spirit will also go away. And while, according to Colin, he was able to free, 200 some odd trapped souls, he said there were many more that still needed to be freed, and he just didn't have the strength. Like, he couldn't do this right now. And so he said, I have to rest and do this at another time. Now, the journalist and the photographer were totally over this and did not care at all. It's 2 a.m. They don't really understand what he was doing. They don't really know if this was the exorcism or if it was something else. But to them, they're like, okay, fine, we'll get out of here. It's late. It's not a big deal. And so the three of them, they began walking out of the cemetery, and right when they got in front of the church, so basically between where the Black Mausoleum was and where that field was, where Colin had been for the past several hours, Colin abruptly stopped, and he told the journalist and the photographer that actually, you know what? He had a little strength left, and he felt like it was his duty to try this again, because he knew he could free more souls, and so he was going to give it another go. And so the journalist and the photographer are like, okay. And so Colin, he gets out his Bible and he begins kind of doing the same thing he was doing out in the field, walking around, chanting Bible verses, spraying holy water all around. And then at some point, for reasons he did not explain to either Susan or the journalist, he pulled out 12 candles from his backpack that he had brought along, and he put them in a circle on the ground right in front of this church. It also encompassed this big Celtic cross that was on the ground, and Colin was inside of this circle, and he lit all these candles, and the whole time, again, he's chanting out these Bible verses, and he stands up, and right after all the candles have been lit, suddenly, Susan and the journalist noticed that the candles begin to flicker, and it's not windy at all inside the cemetery. Like, they shouldn't be flickering. And at the same time, Colin seemed to sense that something was happening around him, and he turned his whole body, his whole presence, and he looked over at the Black Mausoleum and began chanting these Bible verses louder and louder, like he was aiming them at the Black Mausoleum. And as he was doing this, the candles were flickering more and more and more, and at some point Colin actually picked up one of these candles and kind of held it out at the Black Mausoleum. And so at this point, the journalist and the photographer, Susan, they're sensing that something weird is happening here. Like, this is spooky what they're seeing. Like, why are the candles flickering? What's going on with Colin? Like, what's happening here? And for a minute, the two of them kind of abandoned their actual job, which is to document what they're seeing, and they just stood there kind of witnessing this totally bizarre event. But then Susan sort of broke out of it, she lifted up her camera, and right as Colin is passionately chanting out these verses, she takes a picture of him, and the second she does, the flash lights up the cemetery, and then after the flash goes away, Colin, it was like the light went out on him, and he just crumpled to the ground. And so the journalist immediately ran over to Colin to see if he was okay, and Colin, who's like barely conscious at this point, he just kept repeating, "This is going to kill me! This is going to kill me!" And so Susan was about to run over and join her colleague and make sure Colin was okay, but before she did, she glanced down at her camera to see the picture she had taken of Colin right before he collapsed. And as she glanced at it, she couldn't believe what she was looking at. At first she thought, maybe this is some trick of the light, like this can't be right. But then she zoomed in on the photo, and when she looked closely, she screamed. Here's the photograph that Susan took. As you can see, Colin the minister is standing there with the candle outstretched, and behind him is the big church, and on the church, on the left side, there are windows. Now, this church was locked up. Nobody was inside the church at the time. But you can clearly see in the left window, there is a figure in that window looking out at Colin. Now, of course, this is not evidence enough to make everybody believe that, oh, that must be George McKenzie's spirit staring out at Colin. He's the reason Colin collapsed. But I'll tell you, this photograph is not the end of the story. Remember, after Colin collapsed to the ground, after this photo was taken, the journalist ran over, and all Colin kept saying was, "This is gonna kill me, this is gonna kill me." Well, it would turn out he'd be right. Not long after this failed exorcism, Colin would die inexplicably. His death would come as a total shock to his friends and family. No one has ever been able to debunk the photo that Susan took that showed that dark figure in the window of the church, meaning nobody knows what that was. The church really was supposed to be empty and locked, and so how is there somebody or something in the window? Nobody knows. A lot of people think that could be the evil spirit of George McKenzie, striking Colin down, and Susan managed to capture it on film. But, it's up to you if you believe that or not. But I will say, to this day, people go into that cemetery and come out with scratch marks on them and claiming they were pushed or pulled or strangled. And so that cemetery is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the world. And George McKenzie's spirit, who supposedly haunts it, is considered to be one of the most dangerous poltergeists in the world as well.
Oh, wow.
That's something
And
else.
there's so much energies in there, like so many trapped souls.
Trapped souls that ain't got to cross over.
Yeah, and you never know, they might be angry too.
I'm sure.
Especially on Halloween. Got out
Left.
alive.
Yeah, torture.
Torture, and then you have that evil man still in there. And the priest, he actually died.
Yeah.
He was telling them, this is going to kill him. This is going to kill him.
Said it. He spoke it into existence.
And it ended
It
up.
happened.
Ooh. I would never
I
want to
was
go to
joking
that
about wanting
grave,
to go
y'all.
there. I don't want to go.
He can go by himself,
I'm just
y'all.
playing.
He can go by himself. I'm not
Y'all
going.
coming with me? Might change my mind, but other than that, I ain't going.
I'm not going. You on your own with that one.
Boy,
Wow.
that girl, yeah.
That's crazy.
People come out with marks and everything.
Scratches.
You don't know what you could be bringing home with you too.
Exactly.
That's
Because
attached to you.
right.
No.
Man.
It's a no for us, y'all.
Yeah, it's a no for us.
Let us know y'all thoughts about that story down below in the comments.
And let us know. Would you go to that cemetery to experience it with like a group of people or anything like?
Or would you bad enough to go by yourself?
Oh, right.
Let us know
Let
down
us
below.
know.
Throw a thumbs up on the video, y'all. Share it with your friends. This is getting crazy. It's almost Halloween time too.
Spooky season is
Spooky season.
arriving upon us. I'm not ready.
We ready for
I'm
real.
ready.
Y'all be safe. Y'all enjoy your night or day wherever y'all may be at. We'll catch you on the next video.
Catch y'all next one.